Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Mark Schuller, to discuss the history of Haiti and the current conditions that have led to thousands of refugees. Dr. Mark Schuller is a professor of anthropology and nonprofit studies at Northern Illinois University and also is on the faculty at the University of Haiti. He's been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Bellagio Center, and others in researching NGOs, globalization and gender in Haiti. He's the author of 8 books and the co-editor of 5 volumes on Haiti. His most recent book is Humanity's Last Stand, Confronting Global Catastrophe. I'd like to begin with what many Americans, probably most viewers, don't have any recollection of, which is the Haitian Revolution, which was shortly after the American Revolution. Could you give us some background to that and why it's so important today?
It's important today because where we're sitting is a part of the United States because of the Haitian Revolution. Jefferson sent an emissary to negotiate safe passage through New Orleans, and what he got was the middle third of the country, the Louisiana Purchase, because France had lost what they considered to be the pearl of the Caribbean. So Haiti's independence was won on the battlefield in 1803 and declared in January 1st, 1804, the first free black republic in the world, second free country in the Americas.
And you're saying that contributed to the Louisiana Purchase?
Right.
Part of America, becoming part of America.
Yeah, because to the slaveholding powers of the time, the Caribbean was where it's at. Mm-hmm. It's why the Dutch would prefer Suriname to New York City. You know, it's hard to imagine today's economic terms, but sugar plantations and the wealth that it produced for the metropole, for France, for the UK, for the Dutch, for the Spaniards, was way more than the 13 colonies combined, back in the day. So when Napoleon lost what they considered the pearl of the Caribbean, they had no interest. They needed to recoup their losses, and so instead of getting access to the Mississippi River through New Orleans, they got, the United States, Monroe got Louisiana, which is the entire valley. So from Montana over, to Ohio. And
this is not really reported that way or taught that way in high school history classes, certainly not in the media. We may occasionally hear a name like Toussaint Louverture or Dessalines, but we know in Chicago, for instance, DuSable, which has some direct relation to the Haitian Revolution. He was a Haitian American, I guess.
Haitian. He was. He thought of himself as French, as most people did, until the Revolution. He was there to set up friendly relations with the local indigenous folks, and he was there to promote a foreign policy in the United States, an outpost of freedom. The reason why you and I didn't hear about Haiti in high school is because of the way the Haitian Revolution went down. It was a result of the slave revolt in 1791, and it was the first time that slavery was abolished in 1794 as the example of a slave revolt.
Almost 100 years before the American Civil War.
Right.
So, yes.
Yeah. It was because the example that Haiti provided to the rest of the plantation, the U.S. South or the Caribbean, was too much. Haiti did inspire slave revolts, including in the United States. Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, who was Haitian. The U.S. Congress passed a gag rule. You can't even pronounce the word Haiti in Congress in the 1820s because it was the example that it provided was so frightening. It so upset the wealth of the time.
Well, it must have been a cognitive difficult, because if you assume that your slaves, the Africans, the black workers on your plantation are not capable, you suddenly have a capability that's demonstrated with the removal of the French aristocracy and the colonial powers.
And kicking out the most powerful militaries of the time, not just France, but also Spain and the UK.
Yeah.
So all three were defeated by a group of formerly enslaved laborers, and what Michel Rothschild called unthinkable.
Yeah, we can't think about it, so it didn't happen, so we aren't going to talk about it. But we have to pass a law, so we can't talk about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the U.S. Civil War that the United States first formally recognized Haiti. The first country to recognize Haiti's independence was France, but what they did instead is they demanded a ransom of 150 million francs. And compounded over time, Haitian President Aristide estimated that to be $22 billion.
$22 billion.
Right.
And that's paying for what?
For the loss of quote-unquote property, slaves, enslaved laborers. So it's the only time in world history where the loser demands the winner reparation.
I'm saying that has a whole new meaning to reparations when we talk about reparations today.
Exactly.
That throws other whole meaning on it.
Yeah, which is exactly why the French could not abide to have demand for reparations, because it would legitimize other cases for reparations.
The way that we understand Haiti today, the way it's presented in the media, is a poor country, it's backward, not capable of solving its own problems, the economy's in ruins, there's gangs. I mean, how do you get from a successful revolution where you remove the colonial power to where, I mean, I can see that if you pay back $22 billion, that handicaps what you can do for your own population. But how does that transpire into what appears in the media today?
So that ransom in 1825 of 150 million francs, the indemnity is what they called it. Imagine, if you will, for 80 years we paid off China, that our taxpayers, that 80% of our revenue was going to pay off a foreign country, and let's say 80 years down the road, it's Saudi Arabia that buys up the Chinese, and then we have to pay Saudi Arabia for another 40 years. So that's what happened. So when the United States was building telegraph, roads, railroads, irrigation, schools, hospitals, that tax base that we take for granted, that makes the United States the wealthiest country in the world, the tax base of Haiti was going to pay off this debt.
So it's hard to have development when 80% of your revenues go to pay a debt that you're really not responsible for.
Right.
I understand earlier today you gave a presentation here at P&W and you talked about the U.S. Stepping in to fulfill the role that France did, not as a direct colonial power, but certainly as the primary military and political power in the Caribbean, including an occupation for some years. How do we get from 1804 to like 1920s, let's say?
Yeah, so the U.S. invaded Haiti 29 times from 1804 till 1915.
Invaded 29 times.
Right, because we're the local police. Where the U.S. is the regional. They use the word hegemon, like the power in the area. Monroe Doctrine says America for Americans, hands off for Europe. Roosevelt had a corollary, basically saying we will intercede when it benefits our interests.
Yeah. And they did. I mean, I assume that sugar manufacturers and fruit manufacturers took the land or bought the land.
Yep, it was, and also suppressed wages, and Haiti becomes the first time that Haiti was used as an opportunity to export its laborers for sugar plantations in Cuba, because at that time the U.S. was still not quite controlling directly Cuba, but in a neo-colonial state in Cuba and in the Dominican Republic. And so Haiti's role was cemented early on as cheap laborers, and that was a role that's playing today.
This is a history that, again, most Americans don't know, and it's not because Congress says you can't talk about Haiti, but the way they talk about Haiti is a failed state, a narco state, a gang state. I don't know how many people come up to the present, but the name and the conditions that I understand lead to the current state of affairs in Haiti begins with Aristide and one of the first elections that was actually democratic largely and popular after the Duvalier dictatorship that the U.S. had supported for decades. And Aristide gets elected, but certainly Aristide, representing the popular Lavalas group and some of the other popular forces, held out hope for Haiti. What transpired around that time that contributes to the crisis we see today?
So the U.S. occupation, in addition to being part of the Jim Crow racism and the dehumanization of black majority countries like Haiti, creates a centralization of power in Port-au-Prince, which is very important when you think of the disaster response as it gets crippled. And you create an army. That the United States created an army that basically propped up the Duvalier dictatorship, and Duvalier got money from the United States during the Cold War to exclude Cuba from the Organization of American States, and the U.S. deliberately looked the other way when the paramilitary apparatus, the Tonto Macoute, was built and funded by the International Monetary Fund and others. And so, you have a popular groundswell of support for an alternative that he wasn't supposed to be a candidate. He was just a priest.
Yeah, he was a priest.
In urban slums in Port-au-Prince, in urban shantytowns, low-income neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince. And he electrified people, got people to vote. They hadn't been voting before. And so Jimmy Carter, ex-president, tried to get him to preemptively not take office. And 8 months later, he was taken out in a coup. And the CIA funded, bankrolled, and trained Haitian military that was, remember, created by the United States and a local elite population. So this was 8 months into his presidency. 10,000 people were killed. It was a decapitation of the popular movement. And Bill Clinton, when he took office, promised to do better for Haiti, had a very thin margin of victory for his own budget in 1992, where he had to thank people, including the Congressional Black Caucus, and so he made an attempt to return RSD to Haiti. But
where was he removed to? I mean, when you said
he was in exile. He was in the United States for a while. They were attempted to return Aristide in 1993, and the CIA-backed FRAP, the paramilitary organization, pushed back the U.S. military, and that was when the U.S. squeezed pressure on Aristide to sign on the dotted line to basically, in the Governor's Island Accord, agree that the coup never happened and agree that the 3 years that were taken from him would be gone. Aristide signed on the dotted line, agreed to amnesty for the coup leaders, agreed to take away his 3 years of his term, and agreed to basically everything he ran against when he was running for president. And he agreed to these, and then he was returned finally in 1994. So he also was returned with a UN occupation, which also controlled basically took out documents so we can't study them, and basically shifted the power to basically say, Haiti, you're still independent, but you're indebted.
Haiti and Aristide not only inherited the debt that they owed the IMF for funding the paramilitaries, essentially, but they also inherited a neoliberal economic regime, which I just happen to know that Disney was very happy to go into Haiti and make T-shirts and other apparel and games because the wages were 10 or 12 cents an hour, something on that order, which again doesn't exactly lead to development.
Right. I mean, so the neoliberalization of Haiti occurred before Aristide's election, because the finance minister and the minister of economy were Chicago boys. They were trained by Milton Friedman, and their role was to float the currency, open the markets.
Open the markets.
Because the one thing that one could say about Duvalier is that he protected Haiti's, had a protectionist policy, like most countries do when they're developing, like what the Brits had during its industrial revolution, what we had during our industrial revolution. So, yeah, Aristide inherited a military occupation from the United Nations, which was an insult to sovereignty of the first free black republic, and he inherited neoliberal measures that it further reduced the tariffs, opened the markets for foreign investment, for U.S. investment in particular, and forced privatization of the remaining public services.
I don't want to collapse all of history. Like I said in the introduction, you have 5 co-edited books on Haitian history, but to what extent does that immediate past 20 years ago contribute to the conditions that we found in Haiti now? I realize natural disasters like earthquakes or floods or whatever may contribute, but also, I mean, the president was assassinated. And the gangs seem to be ruling the streets, or at least that's the way the media presents it now. So what does this inheritance of a neoliberal program and the debt and the low wages, how does that contribute to the conditions that end up with a president being assassinated?
Sure. So privatization of the government means that you have a parallel government being created, like what they call the Republic of NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. You have public sector brain drain, where you can't coordinate, where there's there's limited ability to govern and actually tell NGOs, here's where the needs are, here's what we need. Don't just come here to do what you want. In 2004, when RSD demanded that France pay back that debt from 1825, French President Jacques Chirac was the first to call for RSD to step down. And the French were in league with the Brazilians. Brazil wanted to have a permanent seat on the Security Council in order to show that they could do that, that they had to lead a UN military mission. So they did in 2004. So they ruled the country from 2004 to 2017 when they were replaced by another UN mission. The MINUSTAH, in addition to documented cases of sexual assault and babies under these conditions, UN troops gave cholera to Haiti. About almost 10,000 people had died from that disease. So you have after a disaster, I wouldn't say the word natural disaster, so you have because the same power of an earthquake, the same distance from a city center in September 2010 only killed one person in New Zealand. Yeah. It's because of the vulnerability. It's because of the lack of state ability to respond. It's because of the privatization that forces families to pay for social services that they would otherwise get for free.
It's not so much the natural disaster. It's the infrastructure and the government and the agencies that are available to respond to the natural disaster. And if there isn't any response network, it's going to be devastating.
And it's also about the ability of the state to regulate. Now, there are rules in the books about how to build houses, but if you're a family and you're trying to save money, you have more sand in your concrete homes than you should. And so that's what happened. That's the concrete is what killed people, and the inability of people to be rescued was what killed people. And so in this condition where you had a disaster strike the nerve center in Port-au-Prince, where everything is centralized in Port-au-Prince, that's why the centralization is important. You have most government ministries totally decapitated. You had this situation where Bill and Hillary Clinton come in, Bill as the UN Special Envoy and the president of his Clinton Global Initiative. He was also co-chair of the Interim Haiti Reconstruction Commission, which asked the Haitian government to dissolve itself for it to rule. And you had a 1-2 punch. During an election season, they forced Haiti to hold elections when people were still living in tents. And they manipulated the first round of elections to elevate one of their own, Michel Martelly, the carnival singer, known as Sweet Mickey, and systematically did not have elections for Senate, for their version of the U.S. House of Congress, House of Representatives, what they call deputies, and the mayors. So he personally replaced the mayors with people loyal to him. And so in any other context, you would see right away that his early intentions were to be dictatorial.
The interesting thing to me is this is not reported in the media. I mean, you will read today about the disputing the validity of the Nicaraguan elections or the Bolivian elections or the Venezuelan elections, but here we have documented evidence where there were no elections for these offices that were appointed and enforced by a regime that had military power to do that.
And the UN occupation was still in force, and so you had the social movements prevented from being able to demonstrate in the streets. This was a gift to the regime, and this was the period where you had $16 billion of aid in the country to build things like sweatshops, where there was, far away from Port-au-Prince, high-end tourism and mining industry, which Hillary Clinton's brother had some interest in as well. So to call it disaster capitalism is not good enough. It's not a strong enough term. But they needed someone locally to say, yes, Haiti is open for business. That was their slogan, to build back better. That was their slogan. And so you had the unfettered systematic misuse of public funds to benefit the donors for Clinton Global Initiative, to benefit foreign capitalist interests, and you have the conditions where which the social movement is just completely suppressed by the UN troops. And then another disaster. Hurricane Matthew struck the south of Haiti in October of 2016. And again, you have conditions where where people would vote as a school or other public building that were destroyed after the hurricane. And this is the conditions of which the United States and its allies, called the Core Group, said, let's go ahead. And they moved and they pushed ahead. So the UN is still there as an occupying force. And then the social movement started to ask questions about where did all this money go? And so the biggest supporter of Haiti was Venezuela through its Petrocaribe program, a South-South alternative to the World Bank, to IMF. And some to the tune of $4 billion. It's supposed to, in other countries, it does build schools, it does build communications networks, it does do development because it reinforces.
But it wasn't long before Obama declared that Venezuela was a terrorist state, and the sanctions came on Venezuela. It got worse later.
Yeah, the sanctions really got enforced in 2017 with President Trump, and immediately the funds for Petrocaribe stopped. And when they stopped, a place like Haiti, it was very noticeable that it stopped, and so people started asking, what happened? Where did the money go? And so you have documented instances of corruption, $2 billion of funds that weren't accounted for. So Haiti's right-wing government of the Tête Calais, the bald head state, was being asked, where did the money go? And so the protests gained steam and gained steam and gained steam. And so, while the United States looked the other way for the elections to have Martelly's successor, Jovenel Moïse, win a fraudulent election, so for a while people were like regrouping, and then they gained steam to demand accountability. And the reason why they were able to do so is because Venezuela's Petrocaribe program was the people's program. They felt more ownership of that. They didn't feel the same ownership of where did the Clinton money go. They could still ask that question, where did the Clinton money go? But they haven't yet. So there were protests that were gaining steam. One protest in particular in 2019 was 2 million people of a country of 10 million, up to 11 now. So in any other part of the world, that would be enough for the president to go. So why is he still there is the big question.
And we're talking about Moïse.
President Moïse is still in power because of the United States, because he was in a private meeting with other right-of-center leaders in the hemisphere in Mar-a-Lago, President Trump's private resort, and Moïse, Haiti, voted against Venezuela to be part of the Organization for American States. So this is like what the U.S. did to Cuba to exclude Venezuela.
So Moïse is president, but he gets assassinated in August this year. Mm-hmm. Yes. So we don't have many minutes. We could talk long, and I would refer people to your book again, Humanity's Last Stand, because a lot of this can be documented there. But maybe we could wrap up with talking about
how we got
Moïse and how he got assassinated, and then how we end up with these thousands of refugees.
So he got assassinated because asking the question, how is he in power? So the United States, Trump, is basically his lifeline to power, but that's not enough for him. He needs street power, so that's when he makes alliances with gangs who, or you could call them gangs, you could call them other things, armed irregular forces that have access to guns that are imported from the United States, that are, the U.S. Customs are allowing to land in Haiti. So U.S. armed, under the table, armed irregular groups, they consolidate, they call the group of 9, and they ally with President Moïse. So they prop him up when his term expires February 7th, brutalize the country, documented cases of violence against journalists and other human rights activists, and things were just becoming too bad for him. And then there was a void of power, of no elections, no heir apparent.
There was no elections from February on. He just maintained himself in power as a president. So
he didn't have a Congress since 2020. So he was ruling by decree.
Yes.
And so there's no elections coming. So he had no legitimate governmental apparatus around him. That's when the assassination happened. So you have a combination of street violence and some political machinations.
So you have street violence, and you have the earthquake, and you have the lack of infrastructure. This all has to contribute to thousands of people trying to find, nobody wants to leave their home. I just want to go somewhere else.
Sure.
There's no way to continue living where I am now, so I need to go somewhere else.
Yes, and so the route that people are coming to the United States, that, if you're seeing the images of the whip, 17,000 people in Del Rio, Texas,
yes.
people living in shanty towns across the border, they were mostly coming through South America. Haitians were given, Brazil was showing that they're able to be first world status, and they were accepting migrants because they needed workers to build stadiums for the World Cup and for the Olympics. And then the left of center government was kicked out of power by Jair Bolsonaro, who was explicitly a nationalist and anti-black, and so Haitian laborers definitely did not feel welcome there. They fled.
Needed,
so they were also being pushed out of Brazil and other parts of South America and coming to the U.S. through Mexico. And so that's when that started. And so you have this perfect storm of a state that was deliberately hollowed out by the United States. Conditions that were worsened by this policy, and people were being sent back to Haiti under these conditions, 8,500 people in 6 weeks.
Theme that goes through this from the time of the first Black Rebellion, first Black Republic, an attempt to have some independence, and the continued intervention of powers, U.S., France, even Brazil, that we have today. So it's a long story. We could talk for much longer, but that's all the time we have today on our program. Thank you, Dr. Schuller, for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.